The rivalry that will define the century. There is a moment that historians will likely point to as the beginning of the end of American unrestrained dominance. It was not a battle. It was not a declaration. It was a quiet, almost bureaucratic announcement made in Beijing in 2013, when a former provincial governor named Xi Jinping, newly installed as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, unveiled something called the Belt and Road Initiative, a trillion-dollar infrastructure program that would connect Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America through Chinese-built roads, railways, ports, and pipelines, funded by Chinese banks, built by Chinese companies, governed by Chinese terms. Washington barely noticed. They were busy with Syria, with sequestration battles, with the lingering economic wounds of 2008. And in that moment of American distraction, China began doing what great powers do when they sense the tide, turning it started, building the architecture of a new world order. This is the story of the defining rivalry of the 21st century. Not a rivalry fought in trenches or with nuclear exchanges, but in semiconductor factories and deep-sea cables, in currency systems and satellite networks, in university laboratories and social media algorithms. A rivalry where the weapons are microchips and rare earth minerals, where the battlefields are the South China Sea and the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, where the prize is not territory but the fundamental structure of global power for the next 100 years. The United States and China are locked in a competition so vast, so complex, and so deeply embedded in the daily lives of ordinary people on both sides of the Pacific that most people do not fully understand what is happening or what is at stake if their side loses. This is the new Cold War, and unlike the last one, nobody knows who wins. The Dragon awakens China's 100-year plan. To understand why China behaves the way it does on the world stage, you must first understand one concept that shapes every strategic decision made in Beijing: the century of humiliation. From 1839 to 1949, a full 110 years, China was systematically weakened, carved up, occupied, and humiliated by foreign powers. The British forced opium into Chinese markets at gunpoint. The French seized territories. Japan invaded, occupied, and committed atrocities of staggering brutality. Western powers carved out treaty ports where Chinese law did not apply on Chinese soil. The old Qing dynasty collapsed. Warlords fought over the ruins, and for a century, the nation that had once been the wealthiest and most powerful civilization on Earth was treated as a subject rather than a sovereign. This is not ancient history to the Chinese Communist Party. It is the founding trauma. It is the wound that every Chinese leader since Mao has vowed to heal. And Xi Jinping, more explicitly and more ambitiously than any leader since Mao himself, has structured his entire political project around one declared goal: the complete national rejuvenation of China by 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic. A China that is technologically self-sufficient, militarily dominant in Asia, and globally respected, never again in a position to be bullied, encircled, or dictated to by outside powers. Understanding this is everything, because when Washington sees Chinese military expansion in the South China Sea, it sees aggression. When Beijing looks at the same maps, it sees a country finally reclaiming what was always its own and building the defensive perimeter necessary to ensure it can never be strangled from the sea again, as it was by Western navies in the 19th century. These are not two sides with incompatible interests squabbling over small stakes. These are two civilizational visions of what the world should look like, and they are pointed directly at each other. Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 after a lifetime spent inside the Chinese Communist Party system. Unlike some of his predecessors, who had been cautious, consensus-seeking, almost deliberately low profile on the world stage, guided by Deng Xiaoping's famous dictum to hide your strength, bide your time, Xi arrived with a different energy entirely. He consolidated power with breathtaking speed, eliminating rivals through a sweeping anti-corruption campaign that also happened to remove every significant political threat to his personal authority. He abolished presidential term limits, effectively making himself ruler for life. He re-ideologized the party, inserting Xi Jinping thought into the constitution alongside Mao. And then he looked outward. Belt and Road. Military modernization on an unprecedented scale. The militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea. Pressure on Taiwan. Economic coercion of Australia, Lithuania, South Korea. A systematic effort to place Chinese technology, Huawei equipment, TikTok algorithms, surveillance systems into the infrastructure of as many countries as possible. This was not a nation hiding its strength any longer. This was a nation that had decided its time had come. The American response from ignorance to alarm. For roughly 3 decades after the Cold War ended, American policy toward China operated on a foundational assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The assumption was this: as China grew wealthier through integration into the global trading system, it would inevitably liberalize. Economic freedom would lead to political opening. The rising Chinese middle class would demand rights, accountability, and eventually democracy. Trade would tame the dragon. It was a comforting theory. It was also completely wrong. China grew wealthier. The middle class expanded dramatically. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in the most remarkable economic transformation in human history. And the Communist Party grew stronger, not weaker, more confident, not more accommodating, more repressive, not more open. The theory of inevitable liberalization collapsed against the reality of a party that had studied the fall of the Soviet Union with laser focus and concluded that the fatal mistake was allowing political reform to outpace economic control. Washington's reckoning came in stages, each more alarming than the last. The first alarm was economic. China had entered the World Trade Organization in 2001 with promises of opening its markets and playing by global rules. What followed instead was the most sophisticated industrial policy program in modern history. State subsidies for strategic industries, systematic acquisition of foreign technology through joint ventures that required technology transfer, intellectual property theft on a scale that the FBI eventually called the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. American manufacturing communities were hollowed out. Factory towns across the Midwest, places that had made steel, furniture, electronics, and textiles for generations found they could not compete with Chinese producers who were backed by state money and operating without the regulatory or labor cost constraints that American companies faced. The economic disruption was real, it was devastating, and it was felt by millions of working-class Americans who watched their livelihoods disappear and, finding no explanation from Washington, eventually expressed their rage at the ballot box. The second alarm was technological. Around 2015, American intelligence agencies began reporting with increasing urgency that China was not merely catching up technologically, it was targeting the specific technologies that would define 21st century power: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, advanced semiconductors, hypersonic missiles. China's Made in China 2025 plan, released publicly without embarrassment, laid out explicit targets for Chinese dominance in each of these sectors. This was not an emerging market seeking basic industrial capacity. This was a strategic competitor, systematically targeting the technological foundations of American military and economic supremacy. The third alarm was military. China's defense spending had grown every year for over 2 decades. Its navy, once a coastal defense force, had become the largest navy in the world by number of ships. It had developed anti-ship missiles specifically designed to keep American aircraft carriers out of the Western Pacific. It had built and militarized artificial islands in the South China Sea, placing airstrips, radar stations, and missile batteries on reefs that international courts had ruled were not Chinese territory. It had tested hypersonic weapons that American defense planners acknowledged could defeat existing missile defense systems. By 2017, when the Trump administration released its national security strategy, explicitly naming China as a strategic competitor, not a partner, not a stakeholder, but a competitor, it was not a new assessment. It was Washington finally saying out loud what the intelligence community had been saying in classified briefings for years. The era of engagement was over. The era of competition had begun, and America was starting that competition from behind. The tech war, semiconductors, and the battle for the future. If you want to understand where this rivalry will actually be won or lost, forget the aircraft carriers and the nuclear warheads for a moment. Look instead at something that fits in the palm of your hand and is thinner than a human hair. Look at the semiconductor, the microchip. Because whoever controls the global semiconductor supply chain controls the nervous system of the modern world. Every advanced weapons system runs on chips. Every artificial intelligence model runs on chips. Every smartphone, every data center, every electric vehicle, every satellite chips. The global economy runs on approximately 1 trillion semiconductors produced every single year. And the most advanced of those chips, the ones that power AI, that guide precision weapons, that enable the next generation of everything, can only be manufactured in a handful of factories in the world, using machines so complex that only one company on Earth can make them. That company is ASML, based in the Netherlands. Its extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, each one costing over $150 million and containing hundreds of thousands of precision components, are the essential tool for manufacturing cutting-edge chips. Without ASML machines, you cannot make the world's most advanced semiconductors. It is that simple. And ASML, operating in a NATO country, under enormous American diplomatic pressure, does not sell its most advanced machines to China. This is the choke point that America identified and has been aggressively tightening since 2018. The logic is cold and clear. If China cannot access the machines that make the most advanced chips, and if China cannot make those machines itself, then China's military and artificial intelligence ambitions hit a ceiling, a very hard ceiling. China understood this vulnerability and has been throwing extraordinary resources at solving it. Hundreds of billions of dollars in state subsidies for domestic semiconductor development, aggressive recruitment of overseas Chinese engineers and scientists, acquisition of foreign chip companies wherever possible before investment screening rules in Western countries were tightened to block them. The results, so far, have been mixed. China has made real progress in mid-range chips, but the leading edge, the frontier where AI is won or lost, remains out of reach. For now, simultaneously, America has been rebuilding its own semiconductor manufacturing capacity. The CHIPS Act of 2022 allocated over $50 billion to bring advanced chip fabrication back to American soil plants being built in Arizona by TSMC, in Ohio by Intel, funded with American taxpayer money, because Washington finally understood that having the world's most advanced chip design capacity while outsourcing nearly all manufacturing to Taiwan, an island that China claims as its own, territory was a strategic vulnerability of staggering proportions. The tech war is not just about chips. It is about artificial intelligence, where Chinese companies have demonstrated capabilities that genuinely alarm American researchers. It is about 5G networks, where Huawei built a global lead before Western governments moved to exclude its equipment from critical infrastructure. It is about quantum computing, biotechnology, and the race to define the standards of future technologies, because whoever sets the technical standards shapes who benefits from the technology and who becomes dependent on it. This is the war that matters most, and it is being fought in laboratories and boardrooms, in export control regulations and university admissions offices, far from any camera. The military dimension, Taiwan, and the point of no return. Every serious analyst of the US-China rivalry eventually arrives at the same island, Taiwan. 12,000 square miles, 23 million people. The world's most important producer of advanced semiconductors, and, in the Chinese Communist Party's view, a renegade province that will, one way or another, be reunited with the mainland, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. Taiwan has governed itself as a de facto independent democracy since 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces retreated there after losing the Chinese Civil War to Mao's communists. For 75 years, the United States has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan, selling it weapons, maintaining unofficial relations, but neither formally recognizing its independence nor explicitly promising to defend it militarily if China attacks. The ambiguity was deliberate. It was designed to deter both a Chinese attack and a Taiwanese declaration of independence that might trigger one. That ambiguity is becoming harder to maintain. China has dramatically accelerated its military provocations around Taiwan. Unprecedented numbers of warplane incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, naval exercises that simulate a blockade, ballistic missile tests that flew over the island. American military planners have run the scenarios and delivered conclusions that are deeply uncomfortable. In a conflict over Taiwan in the near future, the United States would struggle. China has spent 3 decades building military capabilities specifically designed to prevent American forces from intervening effectively in the Western Pacific. Its anti-ship missile arsenal is vast and precise. Its submarine force has grown dramatically, and Taiwan is, geographically, on China's doorstep, while being thousands of miles from the American mainland. The question of Taiwan is not merely strategic. It is the emotional core of Chinese nationalism in a way that few outsiders fully appreciate. Xi Jinping has made reunification a central promise of his political identity. For him and for the party, backing down on Taiwan is not an option that Chinese domestic politics can sustain. This creates a situation where a man with enormous personal investment in a particular outcome has direct control over the world's largest military, nuclear weapons, and the decision to start a conflict that could kill millions of people. The United States has quietly shifted toward harder commitments. President Biden stated explicitly on multiple occasions that the US would defend Taiwan militarily, statements that his own administration then walked back, but that reflected a genuine hardening of American thinking. The passage of the CHIPS Act was partly driven by Taiwan logic, the recognition that allowing Taiwan's semiconductor industry to fall under Chinese control would be a strategic catastrophe of the first order. Neither side wants war over Taiwan, but neither side can afford to be seen to back down. This is the definition of a dangerous moment in history. The economic battlefield: dollars, yuan, and the debt trap. The United States dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. This is not merely a financial fact. It is the foundation of American global power. Because the dollar is the currency of global trade, America can borrow more cheaply than any other nation, can impose financial sanctions that cripple entire economies, and can effectively cut countries off from the global financial system by denying them access to dollar clearing mechanisms. It is an extraordinary weapon, and America has used it aggressively against Iran, against Russia, against North Korea. China has watched this weapon being wielded and has spent over a decade systematically trying to build an alternative. The internationalization of the Chinese yuan, CIPS, China's alternative to the Western SWIFT financial messaging system, currency swap agreements with dozens of countries that allow them to trade with China without touching the dollar, quiet pressure on commodity exporting nations to price their goods in yuan rather than dollars, and, most significantly, a steady accumulation of influence in the global south through Belt and Road investments, infrastructure projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that create economic dependencies on China and give Beijing political leverage in multilateral institutions. The Belt and Road Initiative has been criticized, often fairly, for creating debt trap situations where countries that cannot repay Chinese loans find themselves forced to hand over strategic assets. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, leased to a Chinese state company for 99 years after Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt, became the symbol of this dynamic. But the more nuanced truth is that Belt and Road is also genuinely filling an infrastructure gap that Western institutions had largely ignored. Many countries in the global south have found that China will build the roads, ports, and power plants that the World Bank and Western governments would not finance. This competition for global influence, for the allegiance of the roughly 150 nations that constitute the non-Western world, is perhaps the most underreported dimension of the US-China rivalry. Because the Cold War was ultimately decided not just by the military and economic competition between the superpowers, but by which side could hold more of the world's nations in its orbit. China is playing this game with enormous energy and resources. And the United States, after 3 decades of relative neglect, is scrambling to catch up. The internal vulnerabilities cracks in both systems. Every great power competition in history has been decided not just by external strength, but by internal cohesion. And here, the picture becomes genuinely complex because both the United States and China carry profound internal vulnerabilities that their opponents are fully aware of and actively trying to exploit. China's vulnerabilities are structural and serious. Its economy, despite 3 decades of extraordinary growth, is now confronting challenges it has never faced before. The population is aging rapidly, a legacy of the one-child policy, and is projected to shrink dramatically in coming decades. This demographic collapse means fewer workers, a shrinking tax base, and enormous pressure on pension and healthcare systems. The property sector, which has accounted for roughly a quarter of Chinese GDP, experienced a spectacular debt crisis beginning with the collapse of Evergrande, exposing the fragility of an economic model built on debt-fueled construction and local government land sales. Youth unemployment reached record levels, creating a generation of educated young Chinese who call themselves lying flat, deliberately disengaging from a system they feel has broken its promise of upward mobility. Politically, Xi's consolidation of personal power has created its own risks. By eliminating the institutional checks that Deng Xiaoping had carefully built after the Mao catastrophe, collective leadership, term limits, regularized succession, Xi has made the system dependent on his personal judgment in a way that makes it brittle. Authoritarian systems with no mechanism for course correction tend to stay on wrong courses for too long. Xi has surrounded himself with loyalists rather than challengers, and that means the quality of information reaching the top of the Chinese system is increasingly unreliable. His insistence on zero COVID, maintained long after it had become economically catastrophic, was an early and costly demonstration of what happens when a system has no one willing to tell the leader he is wrong. America's vulnerabilities are different but equally real. The United States is more politically divided than at any point since the Civil War era. Its democratic institutions, which are its greatest long-term asset, are under strain from within, with significant portions of the population having lost faith in electoral processes, courts, and the media. Infrastructure is crumbling. Educational outcomes have been declining for decades. The opioid crisis hollowed out communities across the country, and the political dysfunction in Washington has at times made it genuinely difficult for the United States to sustain long-term strategic commitments, because every 2 years brings an election that might reverse the previous administration's policies entirely. China's strategists have studied American democracy carefully, and they have identified polarization as the most powerful weapon available to them without firing a single shot. Social media manipulation campaigns amplify America's existing divisions. Wedge issues are deliberately inflamed. The goal is not to convince Americans of anything in particular. It is simply to make Americans more angry at each other, more distrustful of their institutions, more paralyzed as a political community. A United States consumed by internal conflict cannot effectively lead a global coalition against Chinese influence. This is not a theory. It is documented strategy. Who wins the verdict? This is the question that